Welcome back to part 2 of my interview with Gregg Braden here on Common Ground at 100.7 WZLX. We're discussing his latest release, The Divine Matrix, Bridging Time, Space, Miracles, and Belief. And I also want to mention that he's also the best-selling author of several books, including his 2 more recent ones, The God Code and Secret of the Lost Mode of Prayer. I don't know if there's anything else you would like to say real quickly about the Divine Matrix, but I'd actually like to ask you a couple questions in regard to the secrets of the lost mode of prayer.
It's all the same.
I know. I think the Divine Matrix is a continuation with the science. It goes much more in depth.
The Divine Matrix was the result of 20 years of sharing this material in countries all over the world, and if I could do it through the translators in foreign languages in a compressed period of time, I felt like I now had the language that I could share this in a meaningful way with people who aren't necessarily scientific or technical, on the one hand, but on the other hand, need a little something more than simply blind faith to understand how we're connected and how powerful they are in the world. So the fact, and it is a fact, that this field is out there, that's where this book begins, and then it leads us into the understandings that we communicate with this field through a language, literally a language. There's a growing body of scientific evidence and a growing number of scientists that believe that our universe works much like what they would call a massive consciousness computer. The entire universe is like a big consciousness computer, and just like every computer has a language that allows it to get things done, our consciousness computer of the universe has a language that allows us to speak to the divine matrix to create the relationships and the healing and the abundance. And that language, ancient spiritual traditions called prayer. So prayer is simply, before there were any religions built around it, the understanding that we were part of all that we see and part of our universe. It was very much a part of the indigenous cultures. And prayer is a language. And what we found over the years is, as good as the modalities of prayer are that we have been taught here in the West. Every prayer is deep and personal to everyone. Everyone has their own prayers. Every modality of prayer has its place, its purpose, it works. We use them all. And having said that, there have always been forms of prayer that are described in ancient traditions that we don't allow for, that we don't know anything about in our culture. We know very little about. And that led to a search in the texts, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls and the hieroglyphs of the Egyptian temples, and personal journeys into 12 monasteries and 2 nunneries in Tibet, and the highlands of central China and Tibet, to understand what we now call a lost mode or a lost modality of prayer. So the little book that you just described, Secrets of the Lost Mode of Prayer, is specific to the language that speaks to the divine matrix that the larger book is describing. So they actually dovetail very well together.
Absolutely, and that is one of the more powerful little books that I have read in a long time.
Well, thank you for that. It was very healing for me to write that book.
Yeah, it clarified several things to a major degree for me personally. And one of the things I wanted to talk about specifically is how we create our own prayers, creating our prayers. And you just mentioned how there are so many different ways of prayer. But I thought one of the best examples was what you gave in the book about Pray Rain, and I was hoping maybe you could share that little story.
I'd be honored. The Secrets of the Lost Mode of Prayer is probably the least technical book that I've ever written. It's condensed into 5 very potent chapters. My mom read the book in 4 hours, so that's my gauge. If Mom can get through it in 4 hours, then I know it's a very accessible book. And what it's all about, Kimberley, is it's describing how we use this language that we haven't really even talked about yet, the language that speaks to the divine matrix, to the field of energy that connects everything together. It's a language that we all already have. To me, it makes sense that we would be born with that language, that it wouldn't be something that only a few special people would have, or you'd have to have a lot of special training to do. It's a language that has no words, nonverbal, no outward expressions. It is the language that we call human emotion and human feeling. And specifically, and this is where I think this book is so powerful, specifically what the book shows is that this divine matrix mirrors back to us what it is that we are already feeling in our hearts and in our minds and in our beliefs. So that is just a little different than what the traditional modes of prayer have said to us. In other words, we typically are people pray when something's wrong or when they need some help, and they say, "Dear God, I need some help. Please let there be healing. Let there be healing in my body or the body of my loved one, or let there be peace in the world." And as well-intentioned as those prayers are, they may actually be affirming and empowering the very condition that we're trying to change. Because when we say, "Let there be peace," what we're doing is implying that the peace isn't there. Or, "Let there be abundance in my checkbook." We're implying that that abundance isn't there. So what this mode of prayer invites us to do, it's a subtle, powerful, little tiny shift in perception and feeling. And it invites us to feel as if the prayers have already been answered, as if our loved one is already healed, as if the peace has already happened, as if we are already wealthy and abundant in all of our relationships, in our finances, in our joy. And when we do that, we're giving the field, we're giving the divine matrix something to work with so it can mirror back in the physical reality what it is that we've created in our heart or in our imagination. There's probably a whole program we could do on that. So this is, again, if the universe is working as a massive consciousness computer, and feeling and belief and emotion is the language that computer recognizes, to me, it makes tremendous sense that if we can feel what it is that we'd like to have happen in our lives, in that way we're programming this divine matrix to share it with us. And this is precisely what we were taught in the monasteries when we were in Tibet. And those little Tibetan monks and nuns, they just giggle when we talk about it. They love to laugh. They just giggle because to them it's so easy, and it's so simple, and it's so obvious. And they don't need a lot of technical explanation as to why or how it works. They just know that it works. So having said that, what I've found is stories and examples are really good ways to anchor these sometimes nebulous concepts.
Yeah, and you have a really good story, but first I need to interrupt you and mention that I'm talking with Gregg Braden on Common Ground at 100.7 WZLX, discussing his work, and go for it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kimberley. The experience that really cemented this understanding for me was one that I had very close to my home, right here in the desert Southwest, in the high deserts in the early 1990s, during one of the worst droughts in recorded history in this part of the country. And it was during that time, and there hadn't been any rain for months. The Rio Grande River was dry at its headwaters. Cattle were starving. The ground was cracked. Crops were dying. And a Native American friend of mine called one morning and invited me. He said, "Greg, would you like to come with me to pray rain?" And he didn't have to ask twice. I said, you bet. And we agreed to meet at a specific place. We met. We hiked into an ancient location where his ancestors had built a ceremonial site for specifically this purpose. And to make a long story really brief, I wasn't prepared for what I saw, because what I saw was my friend David. It's not his real name, but that's the name that I used to describe this story. He took off his hiking boots. He stepped into an ancient stone circle. He closed his eyes, held his hands in a prayer mudra in front of his heart for just about 20 seconds. And I thought I was going to see dancing and chanting, and I didn't see any of that. He opened his eyes, he looked at me, and he said, "I'm hungry. You want to go get a bite to eat?" And I said, I laughed. I said, "Sure," but I said, "I thought you were going to pray for rain." And that's when he looked at me, and he said, "No." He says, "If I prayed for rain, rain could never happen, because when I pray for something to occur, I've just empowered the fact that it is not here now. And I said, if you didn't pray for rain, what did you just do?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, what you saw me do was I closed my eyes and I felt the feeling of what it feels like when I stand with my naked feet in the mud of our Pueblo village, and the mud is there because there's been so much rain. And he said, I smelled the smells of what it smells like to smell the rainwater coming off of the earthen walls of our Pueblo village. And I felt what it feels like to walk through stands of corn chest high with my shirt off because the corn's so high because there's been that much rain. And he said, and then I gave thanks of gratitude and appreciation for the rain that's already here, because in his way of looking, that rain was already present. It just hadn't happened yet. So we went into town. We had lunch. By the time we got back up on the property that night, big black clouds came over the Sangre de Cristos, and we saw something we hadn't seen for months. It started to rain that night, and it rained all through the evening, and it rained into the early hours of the next day and all through the afternoon. And by early evening, it was a mess. The roads were flooded, cattle were stranded, the ground was so dry it couldn't absorb the rain. And I called David, and I said, what in the world's going on? I said, this is a mess. And he was quiet just for a minute. And then he said, that's the part of the prayer that the ancestors could never really figure out. And I had to laugh, because there's no scientific way to prove that his prayer had anything to do with that rain, just as there's no scientific way to prove that the expectation in the laboratory has anything to do with the way a quantum particle works, or that the three practitioners feeling a woman's healing have anything to do with the cancer disappearing from her bladder that we share on. We have video records of that, and I also describe that in the book. We can't prove those things scientifically. What we can say now is there's a high correlation, such a high correlation. When we do these things, there is this physical effect in the world, and even if we don't understand it fully, I think we understand enough that we can apply what we do know in our lives in a meaningful way to help us to become better people, more empowered, willing to love with less fear and create a better world. And as we could study this stuff another 100 years and still not understand it fully, but we can apply what we do know now. And I think that story has really helped a lot. I share that story with through the translators in foreign countries, and that story really helps to anchor how powerful and how we go about this lost language that speaks to the divine matrix. It has nothing to do with religion, and I can see where religions were built around the power of this communication that we all have with the field of energy, the divine matrix.
Absolutely. Gregg Braden on Common Ground at 100.7 WZLX. The Divine Matrix is his latest book. He's also the author of The God Code and The Secrets of the Lost Mode of Prayer. You know, I said we talk about this on this program quite a bit. So essentially, if the whole world were to pray peace, just think what could happen. And you were saying about how nothing can be proved that this works, but I am aware of several peace experiments where people are, praying peace, focusing on peace, and there have been measurable decreases. So, and I know you mentioned some of that too. There are quite a few incidences of that.
We pioneered some of these back in 1980s with organizations, Princeton University, Dr. Doreen Virtue was part of these, Mr. James Twyman. I know many other authors and speakers were doing their own forms of coordinating through the Internet worldwide vigils where they were inviting people to create certain effects, and those effects were happening. When I say we can't prove it, what I'm saying is scientists, unless they can follow and pinpoint the connection from when we do something to when there's an effect, they say that it's not proven.
Okay.
And because this field of energy, the divine matrix, is what's called a non-conventional field. It doesn't work the way electricity does, and we're still trying to figure out how to build the equipment that will detect this kind of event. There are some devices out there. Princeton University has some that will detect this field. So the proof that David's prayer created rain, or that the three practitioners in the medicineless hospital in Beijing were creating a healing in a woman's body, that proof, what we can say is the correlations are there. The Journal of Conflict Resolution published a study in December of 1988 that was conducted during the Israeli-Lebanese War, the first Israeli-Lebanese War in the early 1980s, where they trained people to feel peace, not to think it in their minds, rather to feel as if it's already happened, with no judgment, no attachment to the outcome, no ego, simply feel peace in their hearts. And they placed them throughout the war-torn areas in the Middle East. And what they found was during the time that people were having those experiences, terrorist activities stopped. They dropped to zero. Emergency hospital room visits declined, and crimes against people declined. And when the practitioners stopped what they were doing, all of those statistics reversed. So we know there's an effect, and they say that there's a high correlation between when the practitioners are doing these things and we see the effect. Where scientists are stuck right now, where they have been stuck, is they're hard-pressed to make the connection between the prayers inside, or the feelings inside the practitioners' bodies, and the effects in the world around them. And this mirrors the disconnect between what is being found in the discoveries of the quantum world and the rest of the sciences still playing catch-up with what those discoveries mean in terms of the way we see ourselves in the universe.
So when I was reading about all that and thinking about it from that perspective, and when they stopped doing it, there was a simple answer. We just need to live each moment in peace.
Well, see,
and there you go.
That's the crux of the great lessons from the great teachers. The scientists were saying, and this was actually, they thought it was fuel for their argument that there's no effect. They say, if this way of being, if this modality of prayer is so powerful, how come when you stop, all the statistics reverse? How come when you stop feeling peace, terrorist activities begin again? And that is the essence of the great teachings of the past, is that this isn't something that you do in a moment in time. It's not like you live your life and then stop for a minute and do this very powerful modality of prayer and then stop the prayer and go about living your life. This mode of prayer is based on feeling as if peace has already happened, feeling as if the healing has already happened. And a feeling is something that we can do 24/7 to the best of our ability. We can feel those feelings driving down the freeway, going through the grocery store. And in that way, if feeling is the prayer, and if we're feeling all the time, then we're praying all the time. And in that way, life becomes the prayer from a non-religious. This isn't about religion. This is about a holistic, spiritualistic, unified view that quantum physics now is supporting of who we are, how we relate to one another in the universe around us. And for me, I believe it may be the understanding, the very understanding that brings us back from the brink of destroying ourselves and all that we hold dear at this time in history, and early in the 21st century.
Yeah, and that takes us full circle to where we started in the beginning, and you were talking about how we have the power to blow everything up, but we also have the power to create peace in the world that we want to create. And I am very pumped because I've gone through life thinking, what are we doing here? But I have seen such acceleration. Just be, like I said, having this discussion on the radio is a major, a major breakthrough.
I bet you have. I can imagine there's probably, as different as the guests are, there's probably a common theme, and that common theme, in different ways, all ties back into everything that we're talking about, how this field works in our lives.
Absolutely. Well, Gregg, time flies when you're having fun.
as I knew it would. I want to thank you for being such a gracious host, and for all your vision and your dedication to the work that you do so very well. Thank you for inviting me here today.
Thank you. For you too. I appreciate it, and I'll be looking forward to doing it again sometime.
All right. Look forward to that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, I'm expecting that your curiosity has been piqued a bit, and I'd like to recommend all of Gregg Braden's work. As I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, I read his most recent book, The Divine Matrix, Bridging Time, Space, Miracles, and Belief, and then had to go out and get some of the books that came before it, including his best-selling book, The God Code and the Secrets of the Lost Mode of Prayer. Gregg's website is greggbraden.com, GreggBraden.com. And my name is Kimberley. Please feel free to contact me at any time, and the way to do it is via email. That address is commonground@WZLX.com. Well, that'll wrap up this morning's Common Ground. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll do it again next week. Same time, same station. Carter Allen has Sunday Morning Blues next, and I know you're going to enjoy that. Have a great rest of your Sunday, and don't forget, this is 100.7 WZLX.